And so a faithful sermon is not a self-help seminar, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be helpful. I hope that makes sense. So we're laboring every single week to preach to the head, the heart, and the hands. And so all that said, here's the problem. I think that we have to have the humility as teachers and the self-awareness to see. A preacher's personality, a preacher's experience, and even a preacher's tribe, maybe network, denomination, theological tribe that you're a part of, all of those things can cause us to lean into one area disproportionately to the others. And that's a problem because I was thinking even just this morning, if you imagine that you got into, let's say, a car accident, God forbid, but you had neck injuries and you had like a shoulder injury and you had an ankle injury. If paramedics took you to the ER and a doctor was like, you know what, I only do neck, so you just have to live with the pain in these other two areas, we would argue that was not a very helpful doctor. And I think as preachers, if we pick one of these three areas to be really good at and we neglect the other two, we're essentially practicing preaching malpractice.
Hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast, episode 129. I'm your host, Mike Negliet, and I'm glad that you're listening. Thank you for hitting play on this one. It's definitely going to be worth your time. This is the recording from September 19th's webinar that we put on. We had our guest, Ryan Huguley, come and speak to us really about like emotional health in the life of a preacher or a Bible teacher. The importance of A, knowing what's going on in our own hearts, B, identifying the emotional language that takes place in Scripture, and then C, communicating it in a way that engages towards health and wholeness in those that are listening to our Bible studies, sermons, or classes. So if you are like me, you're probably more comfortable in the realm of like thoughts or ideas or concepts or history or theology. All of these things, I would much rather talk about all of those things than to dig deep into emotional health. But Ryan Huguley is calling us, you and me, to engage in the rest of God's good creation. So I hope you enjoy this workshop where he talks about preaching from the heart to the heart. So I know that you're going to enjoy and benefit from Ryan's main session. At the end, there is a time of Q&A that addresses a wide range of topics. And then once it ends, make sure that you keep listening, because at the end of this episode, there's a section, a preview for our next episode, and there's some great content there that I really can't wait for you to hear. Anyway, I hope that this episode and all that we do here at the Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word.
Yeah, so just to start, I want to just open by talking about what I want to share out of is sort of the basic premise that drives the way that I preach personally. And that basic premise is that we are whole people and that faithful preaching is to the whole person. And so God's Spirit is in the business of using his word to transform the whole sum of his people. And that means our job as preachers or teachers, regardless of what context or form that takes, our job is always to bring the entire message of God's word to bear on the whole person. And so our hearts, our minds, and our conduct, all of those should be progressively changed as we sit under the authority of God's word in our lives. But I think the problem is most preaching tends to be directed at only one part rather than informing all three. We have a bent toward one of these three areas altogether. And so I summarize these three parts as head, heart, and hands. That's obviously not original to me. That's common language that a lot of us use. But just for the sake of review, I want to just discuss these three parts real quick. And then I really want to focus my attention this morning on the heart. And so let's talk about these three areas of head, heart, hand. First, we preach to the head. Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so once the Spirit of God has awakened a person to faith, change and transformation and renewal and all of that work that the Spirit does, it starts in the mind, which means the part that we play in that process as preachers and teachers is we have to preach to the mind. And so a goal of a good sermon is not just to stir people emotionally. Our job is not to get up and to make people cry or just to feel good or walk away to encourage just because of empty sentiment. We have to preach to the mind. And so that's going to look like anticipating objections to what God's word says. It's going to look like helping people carefully, lovingly dismantle doubt that might exist inside of them. It looks like stewarding skepticism with reason. All of us are going to have listeners on a weekly basis that come in with some level of skepticism. And so we have to be ready to address that because we preach to the head. But in addition to that, we also preach to the heart. Just because faithful preaching should emphasize the renewal of the mind does not mean that it should bypass or that it should avoid the emotions. And this has to be said because I think that more and more pastors, especially my guess is those of us that would be listening to a webinar like this, a lot of us are very leery about appealing to people's feelings. And we're leery about that for very good reason. For one thing, we tend to live in a very feelings-driven culture, which we all know can be very, very dangerous. So we kind of have this Disney princess follow your heart mentality that exists, which is contrary to the way that God has called us to live. I think for another thing, we've also seen other preachers and teachers who are very maybe intentional and skilled, unfortunately, at manipulating emotions in order to get response. And we don't want to be guilty of that, which is good. But none of that, I would argue, is truly preaching to the heart. Preaching to the heart means preaching to the center of who a person is. So it's their motives, their passions, their desires, their conscience, and their emotions. And I would argue that Jesus was exceptional at this. And one example of this is just after his conversation with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. If you think back on that, just after his resurrection, remember their response. They said, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" That's Luke 24:32. And so I want you to notice there that Jesus changed their minds as he helped them rethink the meaning of the Old Testament, showing them that it was ultimately all about him. And what I think is also critical to note in that is that there was this change in thinking made them feel differently. Their hearts burned within them with the realization that this news changed everything for them. And ultimately, that's what we're after. And so we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. So in addition to preaching to the head and the heart, we also preach to the hands. And I would argue that preaching to the mind and the heart should leave people asking a very simple question. And that question is some version of, what should I do with this? So it's the question of application or implication. When we have been clear about what the text says or what it calls for, some version of this implication question is going to come up. Other forms of it would be, what action am I supposed to take in light of what we've just heard? Why does this matter? These are all the right kinds of questions to ask every time we come to God's word, even if it's just in our devotional lives, whether it's in a Sunday school setting or a Bible study or it's through a sermon. We should be moving people to this place where they're asking, what am I supposed to do with this? And in John 13:17, Jesus said, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And so knowledge without action, I would argue, and I believe the Bible argues, is useless. And unfortunately, I hear a fair amount of preaching that doesn't really do very much to help people sort out the implications of the information that is conveyed in Scripture. And I think two reasons for that come to mind for me. One is I think it's hard. I think it's difficult to be skilled in helping people know how to apply what it is that they're hearing. So I think that's one problem, is just it's more work for us. And I think a second reason is there's a fear in a lot of preachers of prescribing anything that resembles works-based religion. And so the problem is we should never say more than Scripture says. I think we're probably all in alignment like that. One thing that's weird about these webinars is everybody's face is tiny. There's zero audible feedback. So I'm just going to move forward on the premise that we're in agreement that we should never say more than Scripture. But if we're not helping people to apply what they're hearing in God's word, I would argue that we are certainly saying less than what Scripture says. because over and over throughout the scriptures, we see both of these things happening. I'm preaching verse by verse through 1 Peter right now. I'm about 2 chapters through. And if you even think about the way that First Peter is structured, or almost any of the epistles, like we'll just use First Peter as an example. There's about a chapter and a half in the beginning of Peter talking about the new birth, talking about identity, reminding them about their relationship to God, their relationship to one another. And then he spends almost the entire rest of the letter fleshing out the implications of here's what this means for us. Ephesians is another great example. You've got like 3 chapters of this is what the gospel is, and then 3 chapters of this is what the gospel does. And so a faithful sermon is not a self-help seminar, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be helpful. I hope that makes sense. So we're laboring every single week to preach to the head, the heart, and the hands. And so all that said, here's the problem I think that we have to have the humility as teachers and the self-awareness to see. A preacher's personality, a preacher's experience, and even a preacher's tribe, maybe network, denomination, theological tribe that you're a part of, all of those things can cause us to lean into one area disproportionately to the others. And that's a problem because I was thinking even just this morning, if you imagine that you got into, let's say, a car accident, God forbid, but you had neck injuries and you had like a shoulder injury and you had an ankle injury. If paramedics took you to the ER and a doctor was like, you know what, I only do neck, so you just have to live with the pain in these other 2 areas, we would argue that was not a very helpful doctor. And I think as preachers, if we pick one of these 3 areas to be really good at and we neglect the other 2, we're essentially practicing preaching malpractice. And we need to be careful about all 3. But again, personality, experience, and tribe can all inform this in us. So just by way of example, let's talk about like your personality. Maybe you are, in your personality, you're just naturally more intellectual, rational, you're a thinker. If you're that kind of person, personality-wise, you love commentary, you love to read, you are probably going to naturally in your preaching lean more head. But there could also be an experience that you've had, like maybe at some point in your life you sat under just this hyper pragmatic preaching that was all 5 things you need to do and 3 ways to be better and all of that. Then oftentimes because of that negative experience, we react against it, and we in our own preaching lean away from application, which is problematic. Again, you might have a tribe that you're a part of and you listen to people in that tribe almost exclusively. And the reality is you tend to sound and to preach and to emphasize like those that you consume. And so all of those can be problems. It's interesting. I've been thinking more about some theological tribe generalizations. I think different tribes are better at certain areas of these 3 things than others. So if you think about like maybe the neo-reformed, gospel-centered tribe, that tends to be a very head-heavy tribe. Charismatic preaching tends to be a lot more heart-oriented. Seeker preaching tends to be a lot more hands-oriented. And so as I've been thinking about this morning and this group of people, I feel like I'm going to venture a guess that because this is an event called Expositors Collective, my guess is most of us are going to lean a little bit more head, because there are some heart people I know that don't even know what the word expositor means. So I'm going to just venture a guess that we're probably more head people. And so what I want to do for just a couple of minutes before we jump into some Q&A is I want to talk about the heart. And I specifically want to talk about emotions this morning. And here's why. I've noticed this trend. This is completely anecdotal. This is based on my experience and my relationships with lots of pastors over the last 20 years. And I've noticed that oftentimes those who love theology the most understand emotions the least. Now, that's not going to be entirely accurate for everyone. There are exceptions to that, maybe some outliers. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but I'm telling you, based on relationship with a lot of pastors through a lot of years, I have seen that often those of us who love theology the most understand emotions the least, and I have been guilty of that in my own life. I say that from experience. And so I want to take just a couple of minutes and tell you really about the journey I've been on over the last 12 months, not because I'm trying to like draw you into my own therapy, but because honestly, what I've been going through over the last 12 months has made me a better pastor and preacher than any book or seminar that I've ever attended. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about that before I give us some specific application. And so about a year and a half ago, two things started to happen for me. One was as I continued, I came to faith when I was about 7 years old, genuinely sitting in a little Assemblies of God church on a Sunday night. The pastor shared the gospel, invited people to come down to respond, and I marched the aisle. I mean, as much as I was able to at 7, I knew I was a sinner. I needed a savior, that Jesus had given his life and risen from the dead for me. And so I walked that aisle, and I've been following Jesus imperfectly ever since. But as a part of that, I've been reading the Bible my whole life. I went to private Christian school all the way through grade school and high school, went to college, Bible college. As I already said, I dropped out of all of them, but I did attend them and finish all my Bible courses. And so I've been in the scriptures my whole life. But just over this last year and a half, as I had been sort of just doing my normal Bible reading, more and more I continued to read about a deeper and different experience of intimacy with God in the lives of the people that I saw in the pages of Scripture than I had experienced most of my life. And so I was reading about, these giants of faith in the Scriptures like Moses, people like Hannah or Mary or David. And I was seeing this disparity between what they were experiencing in their own intimacy with God and what I had experienced most of my life. And so it started this 6 to 8 month process of me just praying and asking God to help me experience deeper intimacy with him. And I kept asking this question of what do I have to do to get more of you, God? And so that was one thing that was happening in me. The other thing that was happening in me was these difficult emotions that I had really spent my life learning to repress for the purpose of being able to control them began to spill out in me. And so my biological dad left my mom and my brother and I when I was 3 years old, and he was completely out of my life. My grandfather, who we then moved my mom and my brother and I to be closer to, committed suicide just 2 years after we moved there. And my mom was also bipolar, and some significant mental illness runs through my family. And so I had, just like everybody else, I had my own fair share of trauma in my early lives. The problem was I never really processed it very well. Even as a very young kid, I sort of took on the responsibility of, if I'm okay, maybe I can help my mom be okay. If I'm okay, then I can stabilize my world around me. And when you are a 5, 6-year-old kid, you don't have the cognition to understand your mom has bipolar and your dad had significant issues that led him to leave. You just think, this is my fault. Your brain functions in such a way that you believe you inform everything about your environment. And so that created a tendency in me to where I had gotten very, very mentally resilient, and I just got good at when something hard happens, I can turn the page and move on. And the problem was that worked for 39 years. And something about last year that started to unravel for me. I was coming out of 2 years of the worst season of ministry of my life. And all of this started to come out. And it came out, and this is a moment of vulnerability. I'm going to tell you where it spilled out worst. We were having Saturday night as pizza and movie night in our family. And so we were looking for a movie to watch, and I decided to introduce my kids to The Parent Trap, which when I was a kid was one of my favorite movies, the 1961 version. My kids refuse to watch movies that are older than they are, so we decided to watch the Lindsay Lohan version. And so Saturday night we had pizza. We're sitting there watching this Lindsay Lohan movie. I never thought I would have this experience. And we're watching The Parent Trap, which the original I'd probably seen 50 times as a kid. And I was watching this movie, and I started to have a full-blown emotional breakdown as I started to re-see some of these scenes that I had not thought about in 20 years. And it was this crazy experience of all of these emotions that started to come back to me. And I had to pull my hood up over my head because I didn't want my kids to think I was completely losing my mind, though I was not entirely sure I wasn't. And so the next day, I got on the phone with my friend in Chicago who's a therapist, and I was I told him what happened. and some of the stuff that I've been working through. And I was like, I think it's time for me to talk to somebody about this. And he's like, well, based on the fact that you're crying during Lindsay Lohan movies, that's probably a pretty good plan. And so I found a Christian therapist here in Salt Lake, of which there is only 3 in the entirety of our city. And so there is virtually zero Christian infrastructure here of any kind. But God's grace, I was able to find one here locally. And so that began this year-long process of learning to integrate this emotional health thing inside of me with my relationship with Jesus. Because what I had done is I had taken what was largely the deepest part of who I was, meaning the pain that I was carrying and the emotions that I was feeling, and I'd sort of shoved those things in a closet, and I was not relating with God in any of that, inviting him into any of that, which is for me what was creating this separation and this distance and intimacy with him. I mean, if you think about it, even just as a human relationship, anyone that you do not allow into those deep parts of who you are and what you feel, you're not going to have intimacy with that person. And so what I have found is that in my own life, that pain was the path to intimacy with God, and learning to think more clearly, and I would argue again more biblically about emotions and inviting God into those things has been, I mean, I just can't overstress it. It's been life-changing for me and has resulted in this being, despite COVID and everything that's going on right now, has been the healthiest season of my life. And I think it's drastically changed the way that I counsel and the way that I preach and the way that I love and serve the people that God's entrusted to me here in Salt Lake. And so I would say, as this is probably an area of opportunity for all of us. Here's just, as I was thinking this week about what to share, I think there's 4 things that I would really encourage everyone to think about in this area, specifically when it comes to our preaching and leading to the heart and to the emotions. And the first one is this: we have to learn to take emotions seriously. Take emotions seriously. A lot of expositor type preachers, a lot of Bible preachers, if we're honest, we don't always take the emotions seriously because we have a tendency to confuse healthy emotional integration with emotionalism. We don't want to lead people in emotionalism, where it's emotion for emotion's sake and worship of the emotions. And because of that, we are just very, very skeptical of all things emotion, and that's a problem. And so I would argue that to take emotion seriously, we have to be careful about not demonizing emotion, because emotion is not bad. We serve an emotional God. We are created in his image, and so as a result, we feel emotions as well. And so what I hear a lot of, and I've been guilty of this in my own life for like the first 15 years of my preaching ministry, head preachers love to quote Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things. And we use that verse to demonize emotions and to demonize feelings. And so whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, we end up shaming people for feeling things. But in so doing, we're also, we act out of, we forget sometimes that it's not just our hearts or our emotions or our feelings that are fallen. So are our minds. And so I don't know how we've created this distinction where it's like all things feelings based, anything to do with our emotions. Those are really, we need to be very careful about those things because those things are fallen. But for some reason, we act like our minds are not, that we're incapable of not thinking clearly. And so I wouldn't say that we should demonize the mind either. We just need to take all of the whole person very, very seriously, because many of our own decisions, even as head people, many of our own decisions and many of the decisions, if not the majority of the decisions made by the people we pastor, are being made emotionally. And so we have to take that seriously and know how to skillfully and carefully speak into those things. So number 1 is we have to take the emotions seriously. Number 2 is we need to become students of our own emotions. We need to become students of our own emotions. Or a student of emotion in general. And I would argue that this starts in the scriptures first. And so one exercise that's been really helpful for me and eye-opening for me as a head person, as I did this exercise where as I was just doing my daily reading through the scriptures, I would just put a capital E anywhere that I saw a display or a mention of emotion. And if you were to also do that exercise, what you will find is your Bible filled with capital E's. because the Bible is filled with displays or mentions of emotion. If you read the Psalms for your heart and not just your theology, you will find the Psalms flooded with emotion and this communication of emotion. And so as we do that, as we become students of the emotion in the scriptures, we'll just start to see how every type of emotion is displayed in scripture, and that we serve a God who's big enough to steward all of that. So take emotion seriously, become a student of emotion. And then number three, and this is the part I think that has been the most difficult for me, but the most impactful for me. And that is we have to pursue our own emotional health. We have to pursue our own emotional health. So I would venture a guess that if you feel reluctant to preach on and even to emotions, it is most likely because you yourself have an area of lack in your own emotional health. Humans are so adept at justifying our own deficiency by demonizing them. And so I used to perceive people who felt pain deeply as weak. I didn't tell them that, like in counseling, like, why are you crying? You need to toughen up. But I really had this perception of like, man, if people if they feel deeply, if they are deeply impacted by the things that they go through, it's only because they are mentally and emotionally weak. And the truth was, I was emotionally weak. And I was functioning in what I would argue biblically is a subhuman manner, because I was functioning in such a way that was so devoid of anything to do with difficult emotions. And so some signs for you, because to be honest, I was, prior to starting and working with a Christian therapist and a spiritual director and going on this journey in my own life, I would have passed a lie detector test that I believed I was one of the most emotionally healthy people in my life, for sure. And what happened for me is I ended up taking an assessment on emotional health, and I scored super low in the area of vulnerability. And I was like so shocked. I for sure thought there was something broken in this assessment, because there was no way that this could be accurate of me. And the reason for that I was so confused by that, is I had been told for years that I was very vulnerable as a preacher, because I was comfortable practicing appropriate disclosure in my preaching. And so what I came to learn was that there is a big difference between transparency and vulnerability. There are certain things that are that I just had no problem standing up and talking about publicly. For instance, I can do it now. In my early 20s, I struggled tremendously with pornography. It had a major grip on my life. I've said that in front of hundreds of people before, and the average person listening cannot imagine confessing that to one person, much less hundreds. And so they go, "Whew, this guy is super vulnerable." And it costs me nothing. For whatever reason, that doesn't bother me. And so vulnerability is something that when you talk about it, it makes you want to crawl under the couch and hide. That's how you know you're being vulnerable. There's not categories of conversation, one of which is like, well, these are vulnerable and these are not. Vulnerability really is relative to you. So it's the things that make you uncomfortable disclosing and talk about. And so some signs that you might have some areas where you need to grow in your own emotional health would be lack of intimacy, either with God or with others, is a sign of a lack of emotional health. If you are struggling with depression and anxiety, specifically in secret, if you don't practice vulnerability in your life, if you are feeling or are isolated relationally, if you are constantly daydreaming about quitting, especially, I'm telling you right now, especially with everything related to COVID, emotional health is like, that is going to be the battleground coming out of this thing. And it is the battleground for us right now. I would say if you have more relationship with the dead pastors who wrote your books than the ones who are actually living in your life, that is probably a sign that you are lacking in emotional health. If you have a resistance like I did to feeling difficult emotions in your life, all of those are a sign like I've got some opportunity to really, really grow here. And so we need to take our emotions seriously. We need to become students of emotion. We need to pursue our own emotional health. And then lastly, and then we'll hit some Q&A after this, we need to learn to preach with the emotions in mind. We need to preach with the emotions in mind. And so that means learning to read the scriptures where we are learning to ask the question, like, where is their emotion on display? And that everything in the Bible is there for a reason. And so our job as expositors is to point to those things and to help people to lead out what is in the text, including where there might be emotion on display. Where are the emotions instructed? How are the authors preaching to the emotions? For instance, just last week in 1 Peter, one of the things that I drew into my sermon that I had observed is that especially through this first section, Peter really has two objectives. He has a theological objective and he has an emotional one. His theological objective is to help them think clearly about new birth and about suffering and all of those things, but he also has an emotional objective, which is to give them encouraging hope. He's trying to lift their heads. These are people who were experiencing isolation and persecution, and they were discouraged and despairing. And so he wants to encourage them, not by just telling them like, hey, it's going to be okay, but by taking these very real, very life-altering theological realities and bringing them to bear on their emotions. But he doesn't just go, hey, you guys need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, stop being babies, toughen up, and let's just push forward until Jesus comes. He's very loving. He's very tender in the way that he does that. And I think that that's an area that I have tremendous room to continue to grow, and we do as well. So these four things I think for us to be just continually thinking through in this week ahead would be to take emotion seriously. Ask yourself, hey, have I not really taken emotion seriously because I'm not an emotional person? Number two, become a student of emotion. There is more and more good writing on this, but a huge organization just did this mass study on just the average American's ability to talk about emotion. The average, I can't remember how many thousands of people they surveyed, but the average American can only identify 3 emotions. And I bet if we were to survey the group, we could guess what they are: happy, sad, mad. The average American can only identify those 3 things. And the problem is, as image bearers of God, we are a people that are a sea of emotions that are much bigger than that. And so we need to become a student of those things. We need to pursue our own emotional health. And so that might mean some Christian counseling for you. I know that can be tricky in some of our contexts. And so I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. But pursue your own emotional health. And then we have to preach with the emotions in mind. Make sense? All right. That's what I've got. It is 10:41. I missed it by 1 minute. So let's do some Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for being punctual on top of everything else. Punctual is great. It's a rare gift amongst the preachers.
I'm doing my best.
Yeah, hey, so I'm gonna ask the first question. This is my own question, and then Nick and I are gonna ping pong back and forth, making sure that other questions do get represented. So, guys, feel free, ladies and gentlemen, to continue to type in your own questions. We'll get to as many as we can. First question that I have for you, Ryan, is, so hey, I've listened to the interview that you did with Nick, and I heard about your structured schedule. I heard about how you write sermons in 8 hours or less, and how you plan out long in advance. And I'm not going to accuse this of bait and switch, but I had no idea about this emotional awakening that's taking place. So my question is, like, have you swapped? Have you switched? Is it possible to be an organized, structured, logical thinker while also being awakened to the, emotional intelligence and all that entails?
Yeah, I mean, it has for me. I don't think that any of this has changed a ton. I think the only thing that's changed from when I wrote 8 hours or less, which was a few years ago, is I feel like, just like maybe athletes do, the more comfortable you get with the fundamentals, the more you can sort of live outside of them. And so I'm because I have been so structured in my preparation, I know how long it takes me to do certain things. And so I know, man, if I miss writing my intro on Wednesday, if I schedule that hour block on Thursday, I can make that up, do that. And so I think there's things there. So I don't think this has changed any of the structure of my life. I think that I've started to practice something more resembling like the daily office in my life has been helpful for me because I am a structure person, but I don't think that structure and emotion are antithetical to one another by any means. I think I'm structured, I guess, in how I pursue my emotional health as well, because I tend to be pretty structured in all areas in my life.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. I've got a question here from Tim Moulter. He asked this, feelings have crept into many people's vocabulary and become supreme over fact and truth. How do you guard against that?
Well, I don't think that you guard against it by not acknowledging them and dismissing them. I think it's very important for the sake of I think empathy as a tool is very disarming. And I think that when you dismiss a person's feelings or you dismiss, and first of all, I completely agree that that's epidemic. And I would also argue that all of us are susceptible to that. So I think understanding that in our own lives, being willing to acknowledge that, being willing to really take a person's feelings seriously, and then being able to help walk them through carefully and rationally with wisdom and biblically to be able to help them understand where maybe their feelings have usurped their mind's ability to lead them forward in wisdom is good. But what I have found to be the quickest way to drive someone further into those feelings and maybe further into a bad decision is just to dismiss the feelings, not take them seriously. And as a result, because people feel those things really deeply, I just feel like hands go up and people go into protection mode and they want to fight rather than having a guide who has loved them and cared for them and entered into those things and then has been helpful to kind of lead them out the other side. So I would say be careful about dismissing them, show empathy in the midst of that, and then walk them through it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I see it with a progressive response to scriptures,
Mm-hmm.
where repentance starts in the mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
It literally means to change your mind.
Right.
And we can't change our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
We can't. When you were talking, you were trying to control your emotions.
Yeah.
And only God can change our hearts. Our hearts are desperately wicked, but we can change our mind. And so as a response to preaching, we're repenting in our mind. It's wrong thinking, and then it moves to our hearts, correct?
Correct.
And changes our heart and our emotion, and then we end up dealing with our emotions.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I know that there's this sense in which, as you're saying, this is epidemic in our society, right? And there can be this maybe temptation for us as preachers to feel like we're being heroes when we tell people your feelings don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what matters is the truth. But what you're saying is that actually can do quite a bit of damage. Would I be right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the lines that I've used over and over that I have tried to really embed in the culture of the places that I've pastored is what you feel does not dictate what's real. And I think that's an important thing for our culture to hear over and over and over again. But we also have to be careful in saying what you feel doesn't dictate what's real does not mean that what you feel does not matter and that it does not feel real to you. And so I just think that needs, I think one of the things we learn watching the Psalms or reading the Psalms or reading Job is that we serve a God that's big enough to handle the darkest parts of what we feel. And I think, unfortunately, as Christians and as pastors, we're less comfortable dealing with the dark parts of what people feel. And so we try to keep that at arm's length when I think if we're really going to walk in honesty and authenticity, both with God and with one another, we just have to get more comfortable with the mess that is people's feelings and emotions, including our own.
Cool. Mike, you got a next question?
Yeah, wow, thank you for that. I'm going to be blending together two similar questions from Joe Gomez in Washington State and also from Michael Robeson from Killarney, Ireland. They're kind of asking, how much of your emotion do you show? How much do you let, in the words of Joe, how much of it do you let bleed out on a Sunday morning? Yeah, is there kind of a boundary that you should have? Is it possible to be, you've said it's possible to not be emotional enough. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I'm assuming that there's going to be a boundary on the other end as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the pulpit is not your confessional. The pulpit is not Like your sermon should not be you working out the implications of your own therapy. I think to be very careful about all that. So it's an excellent question. I don't think that there's like a super clear line in this whole thing. So I think we just have to do our best to walk that. I would say I've been transparent. One of the most powerful things, Ridgeline is coming up on being 2 years old. I think one of the most powerful investments that we have made into the culture of our church is by me publicly talking about the fact that I am in therapy. And I've been appropriately honest. Like I don't go into all the details about what I experienced in my childhood or what I'm talking about with my therapist, but I do want my church to know that I have struggles and so I've been honest about that. I've talked about things through tears. And so I think what I've tried to do is try to model my emotions honestly. I would say if you like cry through every sermon for a month, maybe you should take a break from preaching. But to never display.
We actually have a question about that in the comments.
Yeah.
What if you preach? What if you cry every Sunday?
Yeah. I think it depends on what it's about. Some people just have a very sensitive heart to grace or to some, and I think God bless you. And I think that's awesome that people see that. But I would say if you're having like an emotional breakdown that's uncontrollable week after week after week, it's time to take a break and to get some help probably, because it probably is an indication that something is wrong. And so I would say you have to, and I think you can involve community in that and ask if you have, whatever other leaders or staff members or people that love me, like I would ask them what they think about the level. Cause my mistake was definitely the other way. I thought in order to be the rock, in order to be the leader, I have to be stable. I have to not let people see these things. And man, people are going to think that I'm just like the faithful leader. And I think people started to look at me after time, knowing some things I was experiencing. And they were like, this guy is a robot. He's not a human. They didn't look up to it and they were not in awe of it. They thought it was weird, and they were right because it wasn't healthy.
Yeah. So just on that same vein, Ryan, I would just kind of follow up and ask, okay, how do we find that balance though? Because I have experienced this too, where somebody who was really emotional in the pulpit and almost used it as a confessional.
Yeah.
The effect of that ended up being that they lost the respect of the people that they were speaking to.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that, like between being a robot and therefore losing people, and then on the other hand, losing people on the other side because you're such a mess that they look at you and they're like, how can I be submitted to the leadership of somebody whose life is a terrible train wreck?
Yeah. I don't know for sure. I think one question is like, what am I willing to lose people for? Because I think that you're going to lose people no matter how you preach. It doesn't matter. There are some people that are just not. And so I think I've made a decision. I would rather lose people who don't want to have a pastor who is willing to be honest about his own imperfections than to have people leave because they feel like I've set myself on a pedestal that's unattainable and isn't real. And so I've just consciously made that decision. I've made, comments as we've walked through this pandemic. I've made comments about that. I've made comments on the issue of race, knowing that there are people, and I'm very careful and intentional about what I say and how. And this includes my emotions. I let my emotions run out of control when I'm talking to, not in like a dangerous way, but like in a healthy way. When I'm talking to my wife, when I'm talking to a friend, when I'm talking to a therapist, I don't let my emotions run out of control in the pulpit. I don't do that. And so I would be careful about that. I don't let my words run out of control in the pulpit. But I know when I say certain things, there are types of people that will not really want anything to do with that. And so I have to and I think this pertains to everything. I think you just have to choose, what are you willing to lose people for? What matters to you more? And for me, it matters more that I create a culture where people feel comfortable being vulnerable than creating a culture that I would argue is much more marked by self-righteousness.
Cool. Thank you. We've got just a few minutes left in the Q&A, and we've got some practical questions that have come in as well. So maybe as a way of transitioning into those practical questions, I'll ask you one that's kind of a bridge.
Sure.
And that's this one comes in from Cody King here in Colorado. He's asking, how do you practically do this with the emotional aspect in regard to, do you do it with application questions? Do you do it with telling stories? And with this question, we'll kind of transition more into kind of practical aspects of sermon preparation and delivery.
Yeah, I mean, I guess two things come to mind. One is, as I said, I want to point, because I'm an expositor first and foremost, I want to point it out if it's in the text. I'm not looking for a way to make every sermon about this, but if it's in the text, you have to do something with it. And so if there is a significant emotional component present in a text, I would say, then like I think about each point, if anyone's seen my book, each point that I have in my frame, I'm doing three things: explain, illustrate, apply with every single point. And so when it comes to the explanation portion of here's what the text says, I want to help people draw their attention to that. And then when it comes to illustration, where it's appropriate, I would potentially seek to draw in a story there. By and large, I'm not like telling sad sack stories to make people feel something. I'm trying to really illustrate something that is in the text. I might use my personal life if it would be helpful and appropriate. I have a very hard rule of I will never be the hero of my own illustration. It's one of my great irritations in listening to other preachers. Preachers that are always the hero of their own illustration make me want to vomit. So I don't think that's helpful to people. So I will use myself if I'm not the hero, and if it causes me to need to practice vulnerability in an appropriate manner, then I would do it that way. But that's the two primary ways that I seek to draw that in.
Well, excellent. Here's a question from Niels from Norway or Sweden, Scandinavia. Please forgive me, I forgot which country you're from. You might leave it in the comments. Please forgive me. Thank you for your graciousness. Or maybe Denmark. Anyway, so the question has to do with preaching to the hands. So coming to the points of like application. So we've addressed the head and the heart, and now with the hands of this is what you're called to do. He asks essentially, how can we instruct people or charge people towards action whilst not losing kind of a Christ-centered and a Christ focus, where it's like, you must do this. And simultaneously Christ has done it all, but yet you must do that. How do we balance those two aspects?
I think I've tried to get rid of thinking about it as balance. And it's just the one produces the other. And I mean, that's one thing that First Peter's on my mind, because that's what I'm preaching right now. And that's what I see Peter hammering over and over and over again, is you have been given this gift of new birth, and here's what that looks like. And so that's how I think about application. And I think for, especially being here in Salt Lake City, where, at least 50% of our population is still Latter-day Saint, and it's a very works-based righteousness. We make constant distinction about the difference between the way of Jesus on the one hand and the way of religion on the other. And so I do that all the time, at least once in every sermon. I just want to continue to ring that bell for people and remind people about, order is everything, and these imperatives always flow from indicatives. And I'm just trying to find as many ways as possible to continue to have that wash over people's minds while never shying away from, and we are called not just to believe an idea, we are called to follow a way. And that means some things for us.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. Here's a very practical question here from David Sneed. And he asks, first of all, how do you choose what you're going to choose next? And how long do you usually prep before starting a sermon series? What steps do you take in that?
As far as how do I choose what's next, a big thing for me is, we work really, really hard in our service to solicit prayer requests from people on a weekly basis. And so we're using Planning Center for that now, but we use a digital info card, and we take 60 seconds at the end of every service to have people submit their info card. And we've got it. If you listen to the podcast that my executive pastor and I do from the field, we've talked about this ad nauseum, and you can find more information there because I want to be quick here. But we give people 60 seconds to submit a prayer request every week. And the language we use is, hey, if you're not even sure how to submit a prayer request, like think about it like a Facebook status update. Tell us about what's going on in your life so that we can be praying with you. And I, for about 10 years ago, started really using that to be able to see where our church is at, to look for trends of disbelief or like faith issues or common struggles. So that's been a major tool for me, is trying to really have a beat on where people are at. The second thing I look at is just what's the burden on my own heart? What is God doing in me? If there's a book, like First Peter came out of that, I took a retreat day. I read through First Peter all day slowly, and I just felt like our church needs to hear this. And so those are the two things. As far as how start, like, man, I'm the wrong guy to talk about how far out to prep a book before a series before you started, because I just don't do a ton of pre-work on that. I know some people they have good process for how they do that. I'll just be honest and say I don't have a great process on that. I sort of I usually have a general sketch of where I'm headed. If it's a book, I've got the textual breakdown, which I always end up changing as I get into the book. I thought I was going to do First Peter in like 12 weeks, and it's probably going to be like 50 at this point. And so all of that changes. I think the thing to think about with structure and preparation is that provides you the freedom to be able to flex as you go. So rather than be a slave to it, allow the structure to help provide you a safe way to be able to flex in the midst of it.
Cool. Hey, well, we have come to the end of our time. Ryan, it's been really good. Thank you so much for bringing that important discussion and for answering our questions. What I'd like to do here at the end, if everybody watching, could you all unmute yourselves right now? And what we're going to do is we're just going to clap and we're going to say thank you to Ryan all together. You guys ready? All right, let's do it. All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Hey, thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Ryan.
guys, very much.
Thanks, Ryan. Very valuable.
I see in the comments that you guys have a desire to do this more. So we're going to be doing more of these, and we're going to be in touch about that. So keep an eye out for our communications. Ryan, could I ask one last thing?
Absolutely.
Could you pray for us as we close?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Father, I thank you again for each of these people. And Lord, I don't know any of them well, and I don't know what's going on in their lives, and I don't know what's happening in their hearts. And oftentimes, Lord, we don't even know what's happening in our own hearts. And so we just take great peace in the fact that you do. And so, Lord, I just would give these people over to you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whatever time it is, wherever they are. And Lord, I pray that no matter how many years they've been preaching and teaching, and no matter how many years they've been walking with you, no matter how many years they will walk with you, that they would never lose sight and never cease to have their own public ministry flow out of their own communion and relationship with you. And so, Lord, I pray that these next few months and this next year would be marked by the deepest experiences of intimacy with you in any time in their lives, and that would form and inform both what they preach and how they preach and pastor and lead and shepherd and care. But Lord, I just pray that you would not allow us to have one day where we do this professionally and seek to have it all be out of the overflow of our personal relationship and walk with you. And we talk a lot about that, and we use that phrase a lot. And oftentimes it's lip service for other people, and we don't take it to heart for ourselves. And so, Lord, I pray that we would all leave today and we would really wrestle with the question, are we genuinely walking with you? Are we inviting you into the whole, the sum of who we are? And I pray, God, that you would give us the courage to step out in that direction and the strength to stay there. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thanks so much for listening. And thank you to Ryan for your time and also for your openness. Thank you for taking us along the journey and then encouraging us as we continue to journey towards emotional health. We're going to be putting on more of these online webinars. It could be the way forward. And so do get connected to us on social media. We have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter presence. You can also visit our website, expositorscollective.com. You can sign up for our email newsletter. All of those are going to be ways that you can be informed about the next event that we're going to be putting on online. And then eventually, Lord willing, once we're able to gather face-to-face once again. But anyway, this is to tide you over. Next week, in fact, actually next Thursday, we're going to have a bonus episode that comes out. This is the audio from the CGN Pastors and Leaders Conference from 2017. What you're going to hear is the workshop that kind of started it all. This is the first time that Pete Nelson and myself kind of worked together. We were joined by Char Broderson, and the three of us gave a workshop in 2017 on the topic of Christ-centered preaching. So you're going to hear kind of an extended clip from that, and then make sure that you're subscribed so that the bonus episode on Thursday comes automatically to your device. All right, enjoy this blast from the past, and I'll catch up with you on Thursday.
I came here for a Christ-centered preaching workshop. So yeah, well, and you think about too, like just the people in our congregations, the thing that they're dealing with, a broken marriage, family crisis, health crisis, cancer, financial problems, just addiction, all these things, and all they're hearing is, you need to do better, you need to try harder. Oh, if you were only, had your priorities right, then your life would be blessed or whatever, And it's just like keeping on the guilt.
Yeah, and what we'll continue to attempt here in this next hour, but in when I think of Christ-centered, a lot of it's semantics. It's Christ-centered preaching or gospel-centered preaching or grace-centered preaching. It's all the same thing. But when you talk about the gospel-centered, it's kind of sort of a current buzz phrase, that's been thrown around. But the gospel is simply what Christ has already done. And he's already finished the work. He said the work is finished. So in him, so much of the church, when we preach the gospel, we don't preach, the good news. We preach forgiveness, and that's, what's been taken away. It's like in the negative. Forgiveness is just half of the gospel. Praise God for forgiveness, but it's only half of it. And when we teach a Christ-centered, grace-centered, gospel-centered message, we teach forgiveness, but we teach with the same veracity we teach justification by faith. And that's not in the negative. That's nothing that's taken away. It's what's been given to us, and that is the complete and total righteousness of Christ. And that's the grace of God. And so God now relates to us through the finished work of Jesus Christ. So the same approval that Jesus had, we have with the Father. The same acceptance that Christ had, we have the exact same acceptance with the Father. And so we want our people to live life out of that position that they have, you see. And so from that premise, what we want to do is start getting through the scriptures, teaching with all the accuracy that Mike taught with, and that I'm sure you guys do. You do background, you teach the text, and, but how are we landing the plane? Are we landing the plane on the finished work of Christ so that we now live out our lives rooted in our identity in the finished work of Jesus Christ? And what that does is it helps people get to the roots of the way that they're thinking, why they're thinking a certain way, why they're doing certain things, why are they fearful, why do they steal, why do they lie, why do they, all these things that Char mentioned. So that's some definition there.
Because if we're not, landing the plane with, the finished work of Christ and his imputed righteousness given to us as a gift, then all that we end with don't be like Judas, don't be like the disciples, be like Mary. And that's just, again, like we know that we fall short. We know that we're failures, And a lot of preaching just kind of ends with, the phrase just like another brick in the backpack. You come into church and you're weary and then the preacher just like gives you another brick and reminds you, you suck, you know? And it's easy to make people feel bad when you have a Bible in your hands and when you're pointing towards verses and you're saying like, you should be doing this. And it's just like, yeah, we know, we're trying, but like, how? Can you show me how? And showing how isn't necessarily say to do this more, but it's to point towards Christ.
Yeah. And in addition to that, and we tend to, for application, we'll give, so teaching on marriage, so here's 5 ways to be a great husband, or here's 5 ways to not do that and be that. And unfortunately, without a Christ-centered approach to preaching, we can be putting burdens on people, but we're setting them up for failure in their spiritual life. And we are setting them on a trajectory where they're associating their peace with God through their performance. And that's much of the evangelical church, you know, not that I certainly don't have it all together. And that's the thing about Christ-centered preaching, gospel-centered preaching, is that we're preaching to ourselves the same message, and we're continually growing, you know, in those depths.